With an understanding of how generic routing works within web applications and web APIs in modern applications, now we're going to go specifically and see how that generic routing is actually implemented inside of an Express app using middleware in the Express router. Now, in a previous video, or several previous videos, we've brushed and kind of skirted around routing, and we've talked a little bit about it, and we've hinted at it, but we haven't really actually talked about how routers work inside of Express. Now, by kind of touching on it and insinuating and hinting at it, hopefully the concepts around it are kind of starting to take root in your mind. And as we went through the generic routing in the previous video, and now as we're talking about actual routing inside of Express, hopefully all of this will start to coalesce, and it'll actually seem like, oh yeah, well, I already get that. I already understand that. Yeah, I already get that. That's what I'm hoping from this video. So this might feel like it's review only because we have been touching on these concepts previously in other videos, but now we're going to kind of tie them all together. So let's start out with the fact that the Express router is a middleware function that is provided within Express. Now, one thing we can do, as we've seen right here with this 404, as we see right here with our routers, is that Express allows us to kind of inject a route handler directly into our application when we use the app.use, and then we provide a path. So I can say /my route test, and then instead of providing a router like we've done down here and which we've looked at in past videos, we can actually just provide a function handler just like this 404 down there, and we can pull in a request, we can pull in a response, we can pull in the next, and then we can provide the body of our function to handle this particular route directly inside of our app.js file. And we can see this work if I just go ahead and create a response and I send a particular response back. So I'll do a response.send, and I'll go ahead and say, this is a route handled directly in my app.js. And if we go ahead and set this to debug and we start debugging, let's go ahead and put ourselves a breakpoint right here. And then let's pull our route right there. I'm going to go ahead and copy it just so I don't have to type it by hand. Let's go to our app right here that's running, put that route in there and hit enter. Now we can see before we were breaking into our logger when we were learning about middleware. So I'm going to go ahead and deactivate that breakpoint, click play. And now we can see that I am actually handling this route directly by using app.use, and I'm creating a custom middleware function right here in my app.js file. And here I'm handling the response, and I'm sending back this particular statement back to the client. So if I click play, go back to my browser, you can see this is a route handled directly in my app.js. Now this is useful, especially when we're down here handling 404 errors or routes that are not handled by our routers. Problem is that if I had to handle every single route that my application may have, especially when we're talking about every single route for products and every single HTTP method that's associated with that. And what I mean by that is if we go back to our diagram right here, just for this one route, products, I would have two different methods I would have to handle. And for this route right here that takes a unique ID, I would have three specific methods I would have to handle. What that means is that for this route, if I wanted to do a get, put, post, and delete, as well as a get that handles listing, so that's 4 different methods, I would have to copy and paste this 4 times for each and every route that I have, and then I would have to write all the functionality for that right here inside of each function handler for that route and for that particular HTTP method. That means that our app.js file could become massive. Right now, it's already almost 53 lines, And you can imagine if I had to copy this 4 times for every single route that I'm handling, it could become a nightmare. The other problem is that when I'm using app.use directly, trying to handle specific HTTP methods becomes a real pain. So not only will my file become massive, unwieldy, and hard to maintain, it'll also become extremely jumbled with code trying to handle HTTP methods for every single route that is the same route. And that becomes a complete mess. That is where we introduce the Express router. Now, the Express router, of course, is middleware that we actually pull in from Express. So if we go here to our index router right here, so I'm going to go ahead and go to that one, you'll see that we pull in Express, and then from Express we're pulling in this object here called router. And this router object is a really cool set of codes and, well, code and functions that were provided to us by the Express team that really makes handling all the different HTTP methods really easy, as well as sub-routes of a primary route. And so let's look at what that means. And instead of using our index ones, because it only handles one route, we're going to look at our products router right here. But first, we're going to see that we imported this products router, and then down here, like we saw before, when we said app.use, we provided a route path that this particular router is going to handle. And so with this route path defined, and the router is going to handle that path, that means that at this juncture in our application, in the execution of our application, this is what will be passed when any request that has this path in it will be passed to this router. So from this point, we are now handling everything that has a /products, and we can now forget about the /products when we're inside of the router, because the context of our router is now the /products path. So let's go look at our products right here. Now, because we are in the context of /products, we can now handle every single get, put, post, and delete that comes in for that base path, or the /products base path. Which means when we do a router.get and we just provide the / right here, we are really providing a handler, a route handler for, whatever our URL is, .com/products, and now this / right here actually is the / after products. So we're actually just handling this particular path on top of the root path with a get. So if an HTTP request comes in and it has this root path, then our app.js will say, okay, well, it's got the root of products. Let's go ahead and pass it to the router, and it passes anything that is after the /products. And so in this case, oh, I forgot my D there. I totally spelt it wrong. That's awesome. Products. Now we're handling just the / after it. And so here we've got the /. So we've got an HTTP get that came in. It has the base path. And now it's going to handle any path, the subpath that is after this, or sub-route. And now we see that with that, we're going to pass back an array of dummy data. If we go back to our diagram that we had, the one we actually just went through would be this get right here, where we have an HTTP get come in. It's going to a root products, and then with the / on it, which means the root, it's going to send back to us a array of products. Hopefully you can see how that works. Down here, we've got ourselves a router.get, which handles the / with a ID. And we can handle that because it is inside of the /products, which is what our products router uses as its context, or its base route. And now anything that comes in with a / and then a unique ID, it will be handled by this particular router. And so then we have router.get. So this is a get request for a product with a specific ID. And so in this code right here is where we would implement So let's go ahead and do some to-dos right here. We would do to-do find product by passed in ID, and then the next step we would do is to do return product to client. And right here, of course, we're just sending some dummy data back just so we could fill out those endpoints. So with this, we've got a to-do find product based on the ID and then return the product to the client. And if we look at our flow diagram that we had when we talked about routing generically, here we've got a product with a unique ID and we are handling a get. So if we follow that flow, the get stipulates that when we get an ID for this base path here, we're going to go find that object and then we're going to return it to the client. Now the cool thing about this type of a route right here is that when we do the colon right here, we're specifying that whatever is after this slash is going to be a dynamic value. And what that means is that we can't hard code a route for every single product that we may have in our collection because they're each going to have a unique ID. And can you imagine if we had to create a very static route for every single product with an ID? That means every time we added a product, we would have to go add a brand new route by copying this and then putting the ID in there hard coded. That would be a nightmare. So what we do instead is we tell the router that, hey, the colon tells the router that we are going to be getting dynamic data and we want that data stored in a variable called ID. And we want to be able to pull that data out. So what happens is the router parses the URL. It sees that we have data after the product slash, and it then takes this data, puts it into a variable called ID, and then puts that onto a object on our request. And so how we get this ID, just to give you an example, would be let ID equal request.params.id. So this ID right here is dynamically created based on this dynamic route, and the value that actually came in is going to be stuffed into this variable, and these are called request parameters. And so we're passing some parameters just like we would in a function, right? These are parameters in a function. Well, we can do that with URLs too. We can pass a parameter that would be dynamic, stuff it into a variable, put that variable onto our params object in the request, and then we can get access to it right here. So if we put a breakpoint right here, let's go ahead and put a breakpoint in there, and then we run in debug. Nope, it looks like we're already running in debug, so let's go ahead and restart our debugger. And if we go to product/123 inside of our application, so products/123, or it could be, well, let's show how it's dynamic. 123, I hit enter. Here, if we look at our request object, we have a params object attached to it, and inside that params object you can see that it has a value of its own called ID, which has the 123 in it. And hopefully that helps you understand how these dynamic parameters that passed in with the URL can be pulled in and used to go find a particular object in your database. So we would use this ID right here, which came out of request.params.id, to go locate our object in our database. Now to show you that it's dynamic, I'm going to go ahead and click play on this. Oh, let's get rid of that breakpoint right there. Click play. Come back to my, oh, and you can see the dummy data was returned. Now 123 is what we passed before, but we can pass 5, 6, 9, 8, some other ID, hit enter, and now you can see that instead of 123, because that would be hard coded if it was, now inside of our params.id we've got 56982. And that is because this is dynamic. We're telling the router that we're expecting dynamic data to come back, and we're going to need a variable stuck onto our params object that will hold that dynamic data. And with this pattern, we can now, for any of our resources, create a route handler that will handle dynamic data coming into our app so that we can go pull up a specific item in a collection of resources. In this case, it's a product. And so if we go back to our diagram right here, we can see that with a get, put, and delete of a particular ID, really, we can do that by doing this. And you can see right here, I've already got a get with the ID, which is the one we were just messing with. And we can take this exact same code right here, and down here, we can go ahead and pull that ID out of params. And then our to-do on this for the code that we would have to write would be to-do find product by past ID. And then our other to-do would be then to update that product using the data provided in the body of the request. And that comes back to our diagram right here, where when we do a put, that implies that we are going to update data on our server, and we would be passing in some kind of data to update, or we'd be updating some attribute of that resource, and we would pass that through the body, and then the put, the function that handles this put request, would then be responsible for pulling this item and then updating the value, like we showed in our example when we talked about routes. So this is a really, really good overview of how routing works and how we can use dynamic parameters in our routes to then get specific resources in order to update them, to get them, right? That's what the get does, to update them with a put. And then we could also do a complete delete too. So let's just copy this, come down here, and then instead of a put, we would do a delete method that also asks for an ID. Now, instead, we would say find product with the passed in ID and then delete that product. And that would be the to-do in order to implement this particular HTTP method of this particular route. So this is a really brief overview of the Express router. There's a lot more to it. You can create really complex routes to handle that actually have multiple dynamic parameters in them. We're going to stick with this right now, as this is your most basic way of handling all of the HTTP methods for a particular route, and how we pull out dynamic data as parameters in our URL, and how we access those on the request.params object.